So good morning, everyone. I'm happy to talk about some of the experience that we've had in British Columbia, starting to think about adaptation around forestry. And I'm going to be talking about two topics today. One of it is sort of generally some of the efforts where we are underway and looking at how we're starting to try and adapt our forest management. And the other part, I'm going to briefly touch on a kind of a case study, a research project I was involved in, where we actually kind of brought together kind of the science and the policy to try and figure out how we could actually try and inform management and policy. So at the end, I'm going to kind of offer you some lessons as to kind of where that gets you, where that doesn't get you, and kind of where I think we need to go next. This is actually a survey that was carried out by the Professional Foresters Association up in British Columbia. And I'll explain why they're important in the next slide. This was done in this past spring. We had about 24% response rate. There's about 1,300 responses here of the threats or the impacts that foresters are actually seeing in the province of British Columbia. One of the things that the woman in charge of the communications for the professional forester said she'd never seen such a strong response rate. It was pretty remarkable. But what this just shows you is there's a lot of folks out there that are either perceive or seeing immediate impacts on what's happening around their forests. And that's going to be important as we move forward to thinking about how we try and adapt some of our forest management. Given, though, we see this, at least those folks that are out there on the ground dealing with forests every day, and from other evidence elsewhere, surveys of both through research projects at the university and elsewhere that show that there's a high degree of consistency among people, resource professionals, kind of responsible, whether they're within government or working for companies, that climate change is impacting forests, and we need to do something about it. There still hasn't been that much significant change yet in policies that really start to incorporate this or starting to promote adaptation. To some degree, I mean, there is some exceptions here, as always a rule. There's been a fair bit of progress made in terms of trying to expand planning options, but sort of fundamentally changing the planning structure and the goals, that really hasn't happened yet. And we're going to return to that towards the end of the presentation. Before I start going into the details and talking a bit more in detail about British Columbia, I'm just going to take a few minutes here to give you some context of how things work in British Columbia. First, for those of you that aren't familiar with the province, it's huge. So take the Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, Montana, Idaho. That's about the area of British Columbia. I think it might be a little bit smaller. Okay, huge area. I think we've got maybe 5 million people. So you have to keep that in context. And of course, most of those people live down in a little corner of the province down in the urban area. Given that kind of large land base, there's something else that you need to know about British Columbia. There was a decision made to kind of retain public ownership of that land base made back in the late 1800s, the same time the U.S. was going through its own decisions about deciding to end, maintain its own public land. So 94% of the province is still publicly owned. Large land base, vast amount of resources. So what the province has done for the last 120 years and continues to do is a model of basically providing access to public resources to firms to develop for the economic opportunities and benefits. And that's still the model we have today. And the reason you have this picture here is that this creates, especially today around forestry, a particular dynamic, a kind of landlord-tenant dynamic, where the province is the landlord, the one that owns the trees and timbers, but those responsible for the actual day-to-day operations are the firms or other parties that basically hold the harvesting rights to utilize, in this case, these timber resources. And so this kind of can create a difference in incentives and visions and goals, of course, between somebody that actually owns the resource and somebody that there is utilizing it on a basis for kind of trying to keep their mill running, produce a particular product, or meet a certain kind of target goal of how much timber they want to harvest. So that's a dynamic I want you to keep in mind as we go through and look at the rest of the presentation. The other kind of detail on top of that is the province in the last 10 years has undergone some substantial policy changes, especially around forestry. So we already had this sort of delegated system of relying on third parties to manage these forest resources for, both their own economic gain, but also to mutually benefit the province. We also introduced legislation to, given the multiple values for which we manage forests, we moved away from a kind of highly prescriptive approach about how we wanted to do that to relying instead on what we called a results-based cost, trying to give companies the flexibility to say, these are the environmental targets we want to achieve, we'll let you figure out how to do that. Integral and key to doing that is relying on these professional foresters are the ones that are supposed to sort of figure that out on the ground. Given the training that they've had in terms of ecosystem management, standards, the code of ethics that they follow, they're the ones then that are supposed to incorporate those kind of how you manage for these multiple values, wildlife, protecting soil, water, into ongoing forest operations. So that's kind of the picture now that we've got in the province in the last few years. So now we start turning to the issue of adaptation and thinking about some of these impacts that we raised earlier in the slide, or raised earlier in the presentation. And one of the things that is raised then when you start thinking about adaptation, and as I noted earlier, we haven't been doing a lot of it yet, is why won't that be the case? Why aren't you doing adaptation? And there's 4 reasons that could be kind of, and within this there's a host of reasons as to why this might not be the case. Lack of awareness, lack of knowledge, lack of support, or lack of resources. So which of these, where do you start? Which of these might be the case when we start to look at what's happening in British Columbia? So again, we're fortunate that we've got both from the survey that the Professional Foresters Survey Association did, and I will read these out to you since I realize you can't read them back from there, and from a recent kind of provincial vulnerability assessment that's going to be coming out from the province in the next week or so to get some insight as to what these barriers may be. So the first one up there, which is the colored one, which comes from the Professional Foresters Survey, and I'm happy to share that with you at the end, by the way, shows, in terms of awareness, the top one there is lack of employer awareness of impacts. Only 12%, not a big number. If you look down, which is the one that's in gray and white, that's the Provincial Vulnerability Assessment, which is based on a series of case studies across the province. They highlight a lack of concern at the regional scale. The importance of that as a barrier, not important. People are regionally concerned there. They do highlight that they think, and this was regional people thinking that there's a lack of concern at the provincial scale. And this reflects, in fact, part of that policy is made down in Victoria at the provincial scale that then gets transmitted out to the different regions. So awareness, at least for those people that are out there working in terms of climate change, isn't an issue, which we already sort of felt from kind of the response rates we had and other work we'd seen. Knowledge. Well, this is where, to highlight where I think I'm going to focus on the rest of my presentation. This is where things start to appear to be important, and this is where the science starts to come in. 32% up there showed a lack of personal knowledge, expertise, or ability was cited as an important barrier. The highest one here was 43%, which was a lack of guidance, standards, or best practices. And then when we drop down to looking at the provincial vulnerability assessment, a lack of knowledge and expertise was again highlighted, though there they thought it was more around the operational trials. And operational trials are those kind of things where you're testing to see if you plant a different species, how it's going to do, especially if you haven't had it there, or you're trying a different kind of harvesting treatment to see whether or not it improves forest health. And then, since we may as well look at all of these to see why we want to focus on the knowledge, we can take a look at resources. Specifically, resources tied into that are kind of costs, because this is often raised as a barrier. Interestingly enough, only 12% of the folks thought costs were prohibitive, that little orange bar there. Pretty small, actually. However, 25% said my workload allows a little time for this, which again is a matter of resources, having the budget or the time to spend on it. And again, at the provincial level, it was seen as reasonably important economic disincentives for as being a potential barrier. And then finally, support. And support can be construed broadly in terms of institutional support, or as I'll speak to later on, in this case, policy support for adaptation. And again, this actually pops back up again as one of the most important barriers. That blue bar, dark blue bar there, says a lack of strategic vision or policies that support innovation or diversification of practices. 43% of the respondents saw that as an important barrier. And then, when you look down the bottom, that was the most important barrier was seen to be weak government mandate and resources. So I've lumped this in with the support, not the resources there, and I'll explain that when I get to the end. So take a look at the four of these. The awareness, the knowledge, the resources, the support, all raised as barriers to adaptation. And then we can start going to return to this Forrester survey to start trying to drill down a bit more about what does this actually mean. And so there was a follow-up question that they asked of the Forresters that said, do you have the appropriate level of training, I guess you can read this one here, to make decisions? And in this case, only 40% thought that they did, 60% didn't. So this again is highlighting knowledge as being something that you have to focus on. We used a series of models to simulate climate change in this region in the southern interior of British Columbia, about 4.5 hours to the northeast of Vancouver. It involved linked models that spoke to tree regeneration, stand development, and kind of forest development. All the things that relate to the scales of which you do forestry, around planting, harvesting, managing for timber values, wildlife values. I'll show you some examples from the outputs that from these models. One of them looked at tree regeneration, looked at lodgepole pine. Down there shows you different kind of site types, dry to wet. That cryptic acrostic across there refers to a particular climate ecozone that we have within the province there, basically interior Douglas fir. And then this red just simply shows you that if you plant lodgepole pine, as you move from the current to the future, it becomes increasingly difficult in some areas to survive. So that then can become the basis for providing guidance to people that are making planting decisions now. We use a stand model, one of these mechanistic models, to see how stands develop over time. We had baselines with no climate change, and then we had a business as usual with climate change, which is that red, and then a green, trying an alternative regeneration strategy. This is showing you how stressed trees are becoming within this ecozone. Stressed trees aren't good. Bugs like to eat them. Diseases attack them. This finally shows you what that forest starts to look like within that region in terms of age class. Yellow are trees aged 0 to 30. Darker colors are old growth. Typically, we link old growth values are linked to maintain biodiversity. And this is just simply a Google Earth representation because we kind of were able to put it into Google Earth. Uptake. So if you start to think about it, a lot of different outputs here, and I'll show you the website at the end. And this project involved working with resource managers, companies, government officials, foresters, and practitioners. A lot of uptake, especially around some of these planning strategies that I showed you. It made sense to them. Their experience, the impacts, you saw some of these, help them make some decisions about how they wanted to change that. More difficult around the policy support. So if I return back to the possible explanations that we looked at as to what can block adaptation or what you need to move forward, ticked off knowledge there. Definitely can make a difference there, especially applied in this way. For the support, I'm coming to the conclusion that there's a kind of a domino approach to it. Obviously, you need to build awareness for people to want to move forward. Knowledge then helps you move down that path. But to get to the support, the policy change, I think there's really an issue around the resources that you need to have. And those are the next layer of questions you're going to get asked once you've done the science is, what's it going to cost? Is this going to work? What's it going to do? And it doesn't have to be precise, but I need to get some sense before I start making some of these higher level policy changes.